Lovely day, lovely day.
Yes.
Good morrow, Vicar. Good morrow, Mr. Thompson. Wonderful service yesterday, Vicar.
Ah, thank you, Mr. Thompson.
Splendid message. Very kind of you to say, sir. Dreadful attendance, though. Yes, quite abysmal indeed. In particular, a notable scarcity of youth. Yes, an absolute dearth of those in the coveted 0 to 35-year-old demographic, I'm afraid. I wonder what the reason might be. The plague? Likely not the plague, Vicar, as it's not 1397, and all of the youth associated with our congregation are in fact still living. So the problem is not death, but indifference, you say? I'm afraid so, Vicar. You see, I myself have 9 sons, and not one of them is remotely interested in gathering for holy worship. So I query the cause of this generation's impassable impassivity. Fantabulously good question. Say, Mr. Thompson, do you remember how you've spent countless hours in the last month taking your sons to the local cricket games, but haven't spent more than 5 minutes in the last decade praying with your children or reading the Bible to them or talking to them about Jesus? Yes? Well, perhaps the reason your children are dreadfully uninterested in the church is because you've never given them any indication that the church is worth their interest. Pish-posh. Yes, you're right. Positively poppycock. Can't believe I suggested it. Surely another reason must be to blame for the mass apostasy of modern youth. Say, Vicar, do you recall how in the last year of your sermons you devoted 2,852 minutes to chiding us for not loving the Lord as much as he desires, and spent a mere 5 minutes telling us how God loved us so much that he gave us the forgiving blood of Jesus? Oh yes, I'm quite proud of that ratio. Well, perhaps the reason our youth don't come to hear you preach the gospel is because you never actually preach the gospel. Balderdash. Yes, flimmity-flammity flim-flam of the first degree. Can't believe the thought even crossed my mind. Therefore, only one option remains to explain the pestilential spiritual indifference of our youth. You mean? Yes, Vicar. This is clearly the first generation in the history of the world that is incapable of believing the gospel unless it is presented to them within the context of the day's popular secular music. Great sausage pudding, Mr. Thompson, I believe you're correct. Well, there's only one thing left for us to do now.
You are sinners, we are sinners, big sinners, huge sinners. You are poor and wretched sinners of the wickedest degree. We are poor and wretched sinners of the...
Snarf burbling windbats, Vicar, that went terribly. Yes, quite disastrous indeed, Mr. Thompson. Half the youth told me that if we ever tried such a desperate gimmick again, they'd leave the church forever and become unabashed pagans. Yes, and the other half told me they'd become Presbyterians. Which is much worse. The elderly didn't much care for it either. Goodness, no. Mrs. Pemberton, for example, vomited in the offering plate. Yes, and the widow Bumbleshire fashioned a pitchfork out of pew pencils and stabbed me in the kidneys during the benediction. I'm afraid our attempt to get the youth more interested in the church was an indisputable failure, but we mustn't give up on them yet. Well then, Mr. Thompson, what do you suggest we do? I see 2 options. First, we could try the same approach that just failed miserably again in 70 years, at which point the lyrical content of popular music will have deteriorated to such an extent that those emulating this style will find it virtually impossible to confess anything of Christian substance in their worship music. This in turn will instill in whatever youth remain the revivalistic sectarian notion that what makes a Christian is not the substance of what he believes, but the feely-goody feelingness with which he feels it. Such a notion will then cultivate in our youth a faith like the seed sown upon the rocky soil, resulting in a large crop of feely-goody Christians falling away from the Christian faith the moment it stops feeling good to be a Christian. That's the first option. And the second? I could stop being so lazy and actually teach my children that going to church matters, and you could stop being a theological nincompoop and actually preach the gospel to them when they show up. Right. Let's do the first one.